So welcome to today's panel discussion, our opening event to celebrate the launch of the exhibition Counted, Scotland Census 2022 at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. I'm Louise Pearson, curator of the exhibition. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the exhibitions before handing over to our great speakers, Maggie Fyffe, Danny North and Ailsa Raeburn. Yesterday, March the 20th, was Scotland's Census Day. Once a decade, the people of Scotland are asked to complete a detailed questionnaire which is used to plan public services, including hospitals, schools and transport networks. Counted is inspired by the questions asked in the census and explores the complex notion of identity. How is this shaped by our religion, our health, occupation, ethnicity? It is an opportunity to celebrate who we are, to consider what we have in common and what makes us unique. The exhibition explores who lives in Scotland today, who came before us and who will come after us. New acquisitions by photographers working in Scotland today are shown along 19th century photographs, offering comparisons between past and present generations of Scots. With the support of Art Fund, we have used Census Year as an opportunity to bring new work into the collection by photographers from a wide range of backgrounds. These portraits show the breadth of people living in Scotland today, including individuals and communities who weren't previously represented in the National Galleries of Scotland collection. I would encourage you to read and listen to the series of interviews that we conducted with these 8 photographers ahead of the exhibition and which are now available online. Today's event focuses on Danny North's wonderful photographic series, As I Found Her, A Portrait of Eigg, and the themes it raises around community ownership and creating a sustainable future for Scotland. Ultimately, we're hoping to discuss where Scotland is now and where we see it going in the future. Scotland's Census Year also coincides with the 25th anniversary of the community buyout of the Hebridean Island of Eigg, making this a good moment to hear from those involved in the community buyout on their experiences and their thoughts of the future. So the event today is recorded and it will be available on the National Gallery's website in the near future. Please add any comments or questions to the Q&A box, and we should have around 20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentations from our 3 speakers. So first up is Maggie Fyffe. Maggie is originally from Lancashire but has lived on the Isle of Eigg for 46 years. After a number of years looking after her 2 small children whilst making various crafts, she became a member of the steering group who started to look at the feasibility of community ownership. After a hard-fought battle, this became a very well-documented success story. She has worked as Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust Administration Secretary since 1998 and is looking forward to retiring soon. So Maggie, we're really pleased that you could join us today.
Okay, I think that's us all set. For a start off, why we did it. It's a long time in the making, but over 20 years of absentee landlords. Keith Schellenberg on the left there started off well, brought young families to the island, but things slowly descended into acrimony with neglect, threats of eviction, and a chronic lack of security for some residents. And that started us on a road to planning for community ownership. Then we discovered that the island had been sold to Maruma on the right there. He owned Eigg for 2 years, during which time he visited for a total of 4 days and didn't reply to one single communication we ever sent him. This convinced really even the doubters that we could do a better job than that. But back then, there was no land reform legislation, no Scottish Land Fund, but we were lucky enough to receive support from a group of individuals with a particular interest in land reform. It took less than a year, some major ups and downs along the way, but with a successful fundraising campaign. This is us launching the campaign on the right-hand side. Major fundraising appeal. Donations came from 10,000 individuals, and folk did parachute jumps, benefit concerts, and on the 4th of April 1997, our offer of 1.5 million was eventually accepted. And so from then on, the 12th of June has become a day of celebration. And this year particularly so, as we approach 25 years. The Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust is a company limited by guarantee with charitable status. It's a partnership between residents, the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Highland Council with an independent chair. We have 4 Eigg directors who are elected by the community and serve a 4-year term, and 1 from each of the other 2 organisations. And we choose a chair when necessary, someone with relevant experience. The board meets quarterly, and Eigg directors meet on a monthly basis, as does the Residents Association, which is the forum for discussion on any new project or update on existing projects. What was then and still is now, it's really important that we have community support. And previous to the buyout, we've done a lot of work to establish what improvements were seen as most urgent and how residents saw the future developing. Of course, buying the island was just the beginning. The first year, much thought was given to security of tenure, with long-term leases agreed with all existing trust tenants and tenants of the 3 farms. This is something that is absolutely crucial. Folk need that security before they'll invest time and energy in building the future. Because of the community consultation, it's apparent that a new shop and tea room high on the list of priorities, as both businesses were currently operating in substandard buildings. The shop had no running water and neither had electricity, and so no available refrigeration. We created our first subsidiary, Eigg Trading. A design was agreed and the tender awarded to a local builder, ensuring maximum community benefit. And despite going on site in the worst of the winter weather, the building was completed within a tight budget. And Anne Lamerick, as it's known, was opened on the first anniversary of the buyout. It was a huge achievement and a steep learning curve in project management. At the time, the building housed 3 units, shop, post office, tea room and craft shop, which are all leased to local residents to run as their own businesses, plus public toilets and showers. This represented not only a huge improvement in facilities for both locals and visitors, but also created employment. Little did we realise then, in only 20 years, the population would almost double and visitor numbers would increase significantly. And it became apparent that the building was bursting at the seams and more space would be required if the businesses are able to develop further. Also, with the introduction of 3 camping pods nearby, improved facilities were also becoming more necessary. A lot of planning and fundraising later, we've completed phase 1, which includes the new shower block and that you see at the bottom, upgrades to water sewerage, plus the installation of a biomass boiler. An additional 100 kilowatts of PVs to increase electric generation have also just been installed. And despite the challenges of COVID, phase 2 is now well underway. And this will almost double the size of the building and will include further businesses and units and office space. Until recently, by far the most ambitious project and costly project had been the creation of our own renewable energy system, Eigg Electric. I've lived on Eigg for over 40 years, and as long as I can remember, residents have talked about the possibility of mains electric. There was no mains grid on the island, with most households relying on individual diesel generators. The idea back then was a subsea cable, but obviously no electricity company would consider it due to the exorbitant cost for so few households. Over the years, residents have become more interested in renewable energy, and the trust then installed 2 localized micro hydros, one to help power the new pier building and one to supply electricity to a cluster of 5 houses. We started to consider the possibility of replicating similar schemes around the island, but it quickly became apparent that some areas were without adequate sites, and it didn't appear to be financially viable. A full feasibility study with a view to establishing an island grid and based on renewables was carried out. The community met regularly and discussed every aspect of what was proposed, i.e. were wind turbines should or shouldn't be sited, and what level of unit charge might be acceptable. Meanwhile, our local development officer was working hard to raise the necessary funds. Funding came from a wide variety of sources, including a contribution from the trust itself and from residents in the form of subsidised connection fees. And by 2007, we were able to award the contract and work began. All the cable routes, for both grid and domestic, are buried underground, connecting every property on the island, which was actually by far the most expensive part of the project. There are 3 hydros, one 100 kilowatt plus 2 small pre-existing generators, 4 6 kilowatt wind turbines that you see here, which are located to the south of the Sker. The photovoltaic array initially was 10 kilowatts, but later increased by a further 40, and now more recently by another 100 kilowatts. It's at the control building that the whole system is regulated to ensure a continuous supply. This houses batteries and inverters, and also the site of 2 generators which charge the batteries should they fall below 50%. If the renewable resources produce more power than is consumed by the island, then the batteries eventually become fully charged. The frequency of the system rises, and a series of frequency control switches activate space heaters at community facilities, the hall, the pier centre and both churches. As most instances of surplus power production in winter, the space heaters provide a useful and energy-saving complement to existing arrangements. However, the system is of limited capacity, and to avoid the possibility of overload and to ensure the electricity was also available equally to all consumers, decision was taken early in the design to cap the supply to all outlets. Domestic and small businesses premises are capped at 5 kilowatts, and for larger business premises at 10 kilowatts. If this is exceeded, a trip switch is activated and one of the maintenance team is required to reconnect. But because the residents support this concept from the outset and are probably more aware than most of the rating of electrical goods, the situation hardly ever arises. At the beginning, we relied on outside assistance, but the system is now fully maintained by a team of residents who check on the system twice daily and are now trained sufficiently to be able to identify and remedy most problems. A huge amount of effort went into the project, and its continuing success can be attributed to the contractors and residents who worked tirelessly to make it happen. The system's gone on to win several awards and continues to attract visits from interesting parties worldwide. But because of the cap on energy use, it's not been feasible to use electric cookers or heating, which are currently supplied by propane, oil and solid fuel. As part of our ongoing commitment to reduce carbon emissions, we're now looking at ways to increase the system further, with a view to eventually supplying enough energy for heating and cooking. Another important part of our efforts to reduce emissions has been the creation of a wood fuel business. The island has approximately 247 hectares of forest land consisting of a mixture of mature policy woodland, hazel and willow scrub, and maturing commercial forestry. This was planted in the early 80s when landowners received tax breaks and had not been managed since. A long-term forest plan was put into place, and we are now in the process of managing a rolling programme of felling and replanting. With Eigg's remote island location, very fragile infrastructure, Schedule 1 protected wildlife, busy visitor seasons, unpredictable weather conditions, and in commercial terms, a modest volume of timber to contend with, any felling project poses significant challenges. Rather than take a more traditional route and contracting the services of a management company, we took the decision to coordinate the project ourselves, which meant involving a number of contractors for the different elements. A feat of organisation and all slightly nerve-wracking at times, but the first phase went really well. I'm delighted to say that at the end of the project, the books balanced, and we also retained enough timber to supply 5 years worth of firewood. and some for milling for local building projects. Harvest is one thing, of course, but there's lots of replanting to be done. In the past, trees have been purchased from elsewhere, but we decided we should focus on growing our own and have created a tree nursery. Now in its 4th year of production, we've increased significantly, and all the trees required for an area of new planting, 20,000 in total, have been grown from local seed. With a lot more replanting to be done over the next few years, we've purchased a second polytunnel, and the ambition is to replant with as many native homegrown trees as possible, which will help protect the island's biosecurity and boost survival rates. Housing for rent is still on the list. We're never going to have enough houses to house all the people who want to live here. But recently we've successfully purchased the old surgery and garden from the Highland Health Board, and plans have been drawn up to convert the surgery into a 2-bedroom house with a further new build in the surrounding area. As well as all the big projects, there have been many others too. We've renovated trust houses, the community hall, we've created an orchard, converted the old shop into a small museum and swap shop, and we even have our own broadband system, HebNet, which provides an amazing service for the small isles, Knoydart and parts of South Skye. It is important that the trust isn't expected to do everything, but where possible, help create opportunities. There's been an ever-increasing number of small independent businesses, to name but a few. Fyffe for artists and musicians, Kildon Oysters, who just actually exported their first batch of oysters, Lost Map record label, a fully licensed hexacopter pilot, award-winning basket makers All About Willow, who've made heritage baskets for the Outlander films, and most recently the Isle of Eigg Brewery, Scotland's first cooperative brewery powered entirely by renewables. The vast improvement in technology has also allowed quite a few folk to work remotely. For example, we have 2 graphic designers, an environmental engineer, a lawyer, and a sports editor. The commitment, stamina, and sheer will that saw the buyout happen has remained. The desire to make Eigg the best place to live, work, and thrive is embedded deep within everybody who lives here. We're not an intentional community, just a bunch of fairly ordinary, random group of extremely individual people. We're certainly not perfect, but the common factor is we all love Eigg. And whilst wanting to see Eigg thrive, we're also passionate about preserving its heritage, its environment, and its unique way of life. Make no mistake about it, it's not a decision to be taken lightly. There's a huge amount of work involved, and Egg's success is undoubtedly due in part to the extraordinary amount of hours put in by volunteers. Has it been worth it? Most definitely. Since the buyout, the population has grown from 64 to around 110. Some new, but half our people who were here for the buyout in '97 or were children 23 years ago and have since returned and now have families, homes, and businesses of their own. It's really the difference between night and day. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. That was a really fascinating insight, and I'd loved seeing the images of Eigg. So we're now going to hear from Danny North on his series As I Found Her, A Portrait of Eigg, which has recently entered the National Gallery's collection. So Danny North is a photographer based in Cornwall. His career spans everything from shooting for the cover of many magazines, including Rolling Stone, being shortlisted for the Taylor Wessing Portrait Prize, and taking up a role as an Oxford lecturer. His personal work is community-led, including As I Found Her, A Portrait of Eigg, where he has created a story told through environmental portraits shot both inside islanders' homes and in the sweeping, expansive landscape. So, Danny, look forward to hearing from you.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I don't think my talk is going to be as comprehensive as Maggie's. Mine's more off the hoof than Maggie's was planned. It was beautiful. It was really interesting. So thank you for that. Also, I feel like Maggie's is significantly more important because there's so much about the community at the core of everything that Maggie's always done. And it was that which first attracted me to Eigg. I was on holiday in the Isle of Skye, and I took a day boat, and the skipper was telling me about all the different small isle communities, and it was Eigg that really stood out to me. Everything that you've heard really about the renewable energy sources, that alone combined with the buyout, I found absolutely fascinating, and it kind of sat with me for quite a while. I didn't really act on that, and about 6 months later, it was like a bolt of lightning. I had this unknown urge. It came from nowhere to visit Eigg, and I decided to get in touch with Maggie. And well, actually, I didn't know about Maggie. I got in touch with the Eigg Island Heritage Trust, and the first person spoke to me was Maggie, and we had a chat about it. And it turned out that it was the 20th anniversary coming up, and that it would be a really good timing to create a photography project that was community centric. So we actually, from the start of everything, it was very collaborative. And one of the things that me and Maggie bashed around was like how best would something like this benefit the community, because it was my understanding that a lot of people visit Eigg and create work, and mainly academics, films and photography projects about the renewable energy sources, and a lot of people turn up for a couple of days and leave. And I decided that my project, I really wanted to be a long form study of the community, and how I would go about that would be to come up for a few weeks at a time. So my first visit in 2016 was a couple of weeks long, and it basically enabled me to get to know everybody, and for people to trust me and not to think that I was going to be a sort of a fly-by-night and in and out, and really only serving myself. And the foundations upon which the project was built was the idea that in a year's time, when it became the 20th anniversary, that I would hold an exhibition on the island, and that the islanders would be the first people to see the work in its entirety. And that was a really fundamentally important thing for me, because in this age of oversharing with social media, I wanted to show the sincerity and honesty and where my heart lives. And it wasn't about ego and projecting, this concept of being an adventurous photographer off into the Scottish Islands to discover a new world. It was actually purely about I suppose it started off as curiosity to do with the community. And then once Maggie and I discussed how I could get everybody on board and how that would work and benefit those guys, it became very, very community centric. And from what I understand, Maggie put it to a vote, got everybody together and asked, do you want to be a part of this? Is this something we should do? And I think about 80% of the people voted yes. And off I, set off up to Eigg with nothing much more than just the idea that this was going to be quite a special thing to be a part of. Now I'm not moving the slides along, so I guess I wanted to give you an understanding of the foundations upon which it was built. And I feel like the photographs themselves, if I were to maybe go into individual stories, would probably take a significant amount of time. But this is one of my favorite photographs from the project. This is little Maggie, and was one of the first people I met on the island. In fact, it was the second person I met on the island, because I met big Maggie Fyffe, who you just heard from there. And after we had a chat, and I said, she told me to head down to the tea room and go and introduce myself to everybody. And no doubt everybody would be having a beer. It was a Friday and it was very sunny. And told me to watch out for wee Maggie, and that she was a force of nature. And I was in the tea room getting a can of beer just before I was going to introduce myself. And there was a little tug on my sleeve, and little wee Maggie was sat there and tried to trick me into eating a really sour sweet. And that was my introduction to the island, really. Shortly after that, I never really got my camera out for 4 days. I more or less kept my camera equipment to myself, because I wanted to establish, I suppose, friendships and my presence there, so people would understand where I was coming from in terms of what the project was about, rather than just getting it out and just starting photographing without people knowing me. I find that's quite an obtrusive thing to do, especially when when you begin to understand that, you know, a lot of people do these kind of projects and they just turn up, photograph it. Their only aim really is to create something that might go on Instagram. And whereas I didn't know where this would take me, other than, you know, in a year's time, I would return to the island and do an exhibition there. So the pace of how I wanted to work was a lot slower and a lot more gentler. And of course, like one of the key features of any community is the next generation. And I think that building that slow approach and that trust enabled me to get to know the kids as well, which is obviously quite challenging. But one of the most rewarding things about the photography series for me was how the children really loved and wanted to be a part of it. This is Maggie's husband, Wes. Yeah, so when I arrived there, after spending like 3 or 4 days and trying to understand how I could move the photography project forward, it did feel quite a task, to be honest with you, because I got onto this island, and even though it feels relatively small, when you realize the little corners and where people live, it felt actually quite an epic and a task to tackle. So one of the first things, well, after 3 or 4 days there, one of the things I did is I spoke to a lady there called Donna, and she's a Highlander and had been on the island for many years and knew everybody and where everybody might live and etc. And in exchange for a bottle of wine, and we sat down with an ordnance survey map, and she helped me plot and plan and who lived where, and that was really a huge step forward for me in how I could tackle this. Yeah, the community themselves were so remarkably welcoming, and I found that you know, after being on the island for 2 weeks, I found that remarkably overwhelming, to be honest with you. You know, I arrived on the island a complete outsider, and by the time that I left, I felt, you know, like I belonged there. And I think that says a hell of a lot about the beautiful people that live there, to be quite honest with you. One of the things that I was really aware of was how to go about gently intruding into people's lives. I think because I wanted to create something that was intimate, I was also scared of how like that would come across for people when the project was released. And in this particular photograph, there was tension, and that is very much resolved now. But at the time, you could see that, and it was translated into the image. And what I did from the outset was say, you know, I approached these guys because I didn't really ever want it to make it about me and about the outcome of what I was doing. It had to be part of, had to be approved and be a part of the community. And this photograph to me was like a midpoint where I had to say, okay, well, I don't know if this is too raw or too real. But in the end, those guys agreed to let me run with the image because they felt like it was very representative of where they were at the time. And I think it's one of my most powerful portraits in the series, to be honest with you. And I guess when I first started there, I wasn't entirely sure what the project would be. And I may have even referred to it as a sort of a photographic census in such crude terms. And by the time that I finished, you know, a year later, having visited multiple times, you know, people were allowing me to stay in their houses. You know, when I'd returned just the second time, I was invited to stay for a week, 2 weeks, whilst they went away on holiday to see family. And I thought that was, you know, very reflective of the wonderful community on Eigg. And not everybody wanted to be photographing. The project title, by the way, comes from most of the photographs that I've taken were very much about finding people as they were and being as natural as possible. I didn't really want to be create contrived scenes at all. And amongst the photographs, there are one or two that might stand out as not being quite natural as some of the other ones. This one in particular, because I remember vividly that, you know, she was actually quite terrified of having a photograph taken. So to make it more relaxing for her, the chicken became a prop, and yeah, so whilst the project itself is called As I Found Her, I do understand that a couple of images are not quite up to that description. And a year after the project, I returned for the first time with some friends to help me set up the exhibition, and we did. We hung the prints off fishing wire, weighted down throughout the village hall, and we were open pretty much all day, and people were invited down to come and look. And at the end of that exhibition, which was just a day long, they were invited to take their prints home. And it was one of the most satisfying and beautiful experiences of my entire life, because I feel like the work that I created, perhaps maybe the only time I'll ever create work that has this effect, was it sort of transcended any intentions that I ever had, and became an absolute beautiful part of the community that now sits in a book in the Eigg archives for many generations to come. And it was the whole experience was deeply satisfying and at times genuinely moving. And yeah, I think that I'm very, very happy to have had this work put into the Scottish National Gallery, where I think it really, you know, truly does belong back in the hands of the people. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Danny. It's really great to see a full range of the portraits that you made during the series and your thoughtful reflections on your time on Eigg. We're now going to hear from Ailsa Raeburn, who is going to speak about the state of play of community buyouts in Scotland more generally. Ailsa has been involved with the community land sector now for a number of years. She is chair of the Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust and has also served as the director on the Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust, and has supported communities across Scotland to acquire and develop local land and buildings. As head of the community assets team at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, she was responsible for the development and management of Scottish Land Fund in partnership with Big Lottery Scotland and on behalf of the Scottish Government. She's particularly interested in the challenges of establishing and growing community enterprises in rural areas, especially those addressing regeneration and repopulation objectives. So, Ailsa, looking forward to hearing your insights.
Thanks very much, Louise. I'll get my presentation working, and hopefully I can share that with you. So just while I'm doing that, it was a really great honour to be asked to be the independent chair of Eigg, which Maggie's explained that they have an independent chair. So I'm actually based down in Argyll, but it's a really amazing community to be involved with. And as Maggie said, you know, on Eigg, it's all about people. You know, it's people committing time and effort, hundreds of hours of volunteer hours to making things happen. And I think Maggie also talked in a bit of detail about the renewable energy scheme they've got there, and there are a huge number of lessons to learn from how Eigg thinks about its natural resources and uses energy, particularly today when we're all much more aware of how much energy costs and where it comes from. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from how Eigg thinks about its energy and natural capital. And Danny's presentation was really interesting. I'd seen some of those some of those images, but it's great to see more of them as a collection there. And I think Danny's approach has been incredibly valuable, because so many people see the Highlands and Islands as a landscape, you know, as a beautiful place to be with great biodiversity and wondrous animals and wildlife, and they impose their own visions on it and their own perceptions and ideas of what that landscape should look like. And that tends to generally ignore the really incredibly valuable cultural and community heritage of those places. So I think Danny's exhibition really highlights that these places are full of people, and they have been full of people in the past, and they're still full of people now, and they're not just landscapes. So thanks, Louise and Grania, for the opportunity to talk today. So you've asked me just to run through briefly the bit of history about community land ownership and where it's going. So hopefully you can see my slides okay. I'm the chair of Community Land Scotland, as Louise has introduced, and we, the representative body for community landowners across rural and urban Scotland. So we advocate for land reform and community ownership policy and support for community owners. We spend a lot of time supporting communities to share their own learning with each other. So Eigg has been visited by probably every community landowner in the country, to learn what they've done to avoid reinventing the wheel every time. And we spend a lot of time raising awareness of what communities like Eigg can do and how they can contribute to Scotland being a fairer, more sustainable society. So community ownership has a long history in Scotland. It's 100 years next year of what we would know as community ownership. So that's ownership of a piece of land or an asset by a geographically defined community. So it's the people in that place that own the asset. And the first major ownership was the Stornoway Trust, who took the residue of the Leverhulme estate in Lewis in 1923. And since then, there have been several sort of really key events. A lot of people will have heard of the 7 Men of Knoydart and the land raid, when soldiers returning after the war were looking for land. The first modern major buyout was the Assynt Crofters in 1993. And then in 1996, there was the seminal work by Andy Whiteman, who really drew to the public's attention the issues of concentration of land ownership in Scotland. We've heard about Eigg in 97, and then the Scottish Parliament after devolution. One of the first things that Donald Dewar spoke about was the symbolism of land reform, and that needing to be one of the first actions of the new Parliament. So I've outlined here some of the other major acquisitions. Knoydart, following that land raid, it took 50 odd years for it to become into community ownership, but they've been hugely successful in all they've done. Gear has just celebrated its 20th anniversary. Storrish Uist in 2006 acquired 92,000 acres of land in Benbecula and Eriska and South Uist. And then we've had legislation and funding from Scottish Government to support more community ownership. And in 2016, community ownership became urban and extended the community rights to buy to urban communities as well. And the first 2 major acquisitions are actually churches, a Church of Scotland church in Portobello in Edinburgh, and a Roman Catholic church and priest house in Balmulloch in Glasgow, both really essential parts of local community. And then most recently, we've had the Langham buyout. So the community there, really inspiring and ambitious community, acquired just over 5,000 acres from the Buccleuch estate last year, and are just completing their funding for an additional 5,000 acres from Buccleuch this year, and that's to create the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve. So quite often, particularly critics of community ownership, will talk about it constantly reverting to the past and trying to revert past wrongs of the clearances, of feudalism. And I've got 2 really famous images here that are well set in the public imagination of what happened in a lot of Highland communities. So I say criticism is often that it's looking backwards, but some of those issues that were prevalent in the 18th, 19th and 20th century is still prevalent today. The concentration of landed wealth, power and prestige is still a huge issue, particularly in rural Scotland. And you can see one of the key facts here: less than 1/4% of the population owns 67% of rural land. And we all know that with land comes power and prestige and the ability to control other people's lives. And Maggie's story of Eigg pre-buyout is a great example of what can happen. So it's about dealing with that concentrated land wealth, but very much about looking forward and not looking backwards, about not righting previous wrongs, but about giving communities the opportunity to develop. And we've got some great quotes here from communities across Scotland about giving them the future to control themselves, shaping their own future, opening up opportunities, about self-determination and autonomy, a catalyst for enthusiasm and a sense of pride, and a say in what happens in their community. And that's absolutely critical for most communities. And Egg's a really great example of that. They had landlords that didn't invest, that evicted tenants, that wouldn't allow businesses to establish. And what community ownership has done on Eigg, and in lots of other places, is enabled all of that. So it allows communities and people in those communities to have a say. So anybody can become a member of your local community trust. Anybody can go onto the board of that community trust. Anybody can be the chair. You don't need particular skills or experience. You just need to live locally and be interested in what's happening locally and want to see your local community improve. It's about governance, so it's ensuring that the assets that the community acquire are properly managed, and that the local people have a control over what happens over them, so everybody gets to have their say. It's about transparency, and that's obviously a huge issue today when so much of Scotland is owned by offshore companies. It's really difficult to find out who the owners are. There's a huge amount of vacant and derelict land in Scotland's cities and abandoned and neglected buildings, and often that's held in private companies. It's really difficult to establish who the owners are. So there are changes happening on that, but much more is required. And of course, community ownership, everybody knows who owns it, everybody knows who's in charge of it. As I say, everybody can become a director. It also gives the dispossessed a voice. So those people that don't generally are not really able to contribute for a number of reasons to sort of local discussions. And that might be young people who don't have an in to community councils and being a councillor for all sorts of reasons. It might be young families and working age people that don't have the time to contribute. Everybody gets to have a say about what happens, and that's really the only form of governance in Scotland at the moment where that's really important. Community ownership is also about deciding what the community needs. So Maggie talked on there about Eigg, about needing a new shop, about wanting to move away from diesel generators and having 24/7 renewable energy. It's about providing decent housing for people. It's about building community wealth, so generating income for the local community to reinvest in projects. And it's about preventing that local land wealth, whether that's income from forestry or income from renewables, being lost from communities. So these stats are slightly out of date now, but community ownership has seen exponential growth and will continue to do that with the commitment of Scottish Government, both in terms of funding and legislation. There are fewer really large estate buyouts, but much more now it's about buying the last shop in the village and making sure it stays open. It's about buying land for housing, for affordable housing, or it's about buying the pub to make sure it's not lost. And communities now are involved in a massive range of different types of assets and developments, and this is gear where they're just developing a new campsite and by the pier and motorhome site with a view to managing some of the worst aspects of wild camping on the island, which is a really strong farming island, and ensuring that motorhomes have the right sort of services. It's also about reducing car-borne traffic to the island because there's only a single road. So communities are involved in housing and business and forestry and sporting estates, huge range of different types of development. They're very focused on depopulation. Lots of areas of the North and West Highlands have a forecast fall in working age population of 40% by 2046. So many communities now are leading on affordable housing for young people and working age people to either return or to stay in their communities. And that's happening right up in the Western Isles over to Gairloch, down to the Small Isles and Knoydart, Colonsay, Gear. And they're also really interested in how they can help contribute to managing the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity. And many communities are now taking forward projects like Tarras Valley and Langham, which is ecological restoration and native woodland planting, to developing their own renewable schemes, such as hydro and solar and wind, much of which is funded through crowdfunding. And the Just Transition Commission has recognised the role that communities need to play in this to ensure that the benefits of net zero can be fairly shared. And there's the international aspect as well. So Community Land Scotland are a member of the International Land Coalition, and a lot of the issues we're facing here in Scotland around the gold rush to net zero, around land grabbing, around carbon offsetting, around issues around access to affordable housing are being experienced worldwide. What's interesting about Scotland is that quite often we're at the forefront of a lot of these issues, and that Scottish Government since devolution has introduced land reform and has introduced support for community ownership. So we've got lots of good lessons that we can share internationally. So community land ownership, great quote here from Slate: community trust up in Skye. It means a future for our community. It means that we're in control. It means that we can decide what we're going to do with our land and who's going to benefit from it. So thanks, Louise. That's all I was going to say, but really happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Ailsa, and thank you for everyone for a really wide-ranging introduction to what I think everyone will agree is a really fascinating topic. So as Ailsa says, we're now going to take questions. We've got about 10 minutes to do that. So if you have got any questions, please do put them in the question and answer box, and we'll hope to get to you. But I think we'll start with a question that I've been kind of thinking about in the preparation for this exhibition, and I was interested to hear your insights into it, in that how you felt Scotland, and perhaps in particular Eigg, has changed since the last census in 2011. Perhaps Ailsa or Maggie, you've kind of noticed changes in the last decade.
Well, we've seen a big increase in the population. I mean, that's the biggest difference. And I think we've also seen, I think what I spoke about, individual businesses, not the trust. I think that's important too, you know, that the trust isn't seen as everything. And I think because people have been given the opportunity to have secure accommodation, either by building a house or renting a secure house, then they will invest in that future. And people have come up with some amazing ideas for new businesses, which are being, you know, very, very successful. So I think that's probably the biggest change.
I'd say, Louise, that from a community's perspective, it's around sort of the ambition and aspiration that communities now show, because there is the support there for them to get on and do things. So 20 years ago, you know, if the local authority said, you know, this is your choice of school, this has happened in Strontian in our American, the council there offered the community a school building which was really completely not suitable for them. So they decided, well, actually, we don't want that, so we're going to buy a bit of land and we're going to build our own school. We're going to lease it to the council, and if the council no longer wants it after a period of time, we'll build it in such a way we can convert it back to housing. And that's what they've done. And in Glen Urquhart, the NHS didn't offer the community the health services they wanted, so they built their own doctor's surgery. So I think it's this whole thing that communities now think, actually, what's on offer? And that partly is a result of austerity and what's happening in local government, that, you know, that the services are just not there anymore. Communities now have the ambition and the aspiration and the capacity and the skills to do many more things for themselves. And that's all focused on access to land and resources.
Yeah, I think that maybe there's the blueprints there to kind of see what's possible, so people have got the confidence to put forward projects that they might not have done so in the past. I think one of the things that's really come out, you know, in all of your talks is about, you know, planning for the future and sustainability. So I don't know if anyone had any further kind of comments or thoughts about how important that's going to be in the kind of future of Scottish land ownership.
I don't want to dominate, I'll let Danny have a speak in a minute, but I think it's incredibly important. And most communities, of course, are planning for the long term, because, you know, they're thinking about, well, where are my kids going to live? You know, we're being priced out. You know, there's a big issue with holiday homes and second homes, and young people not being able to afford to buy housing, and people be able to come back. So communities tend to think about the long term, and what they want their community to look like in the future. So, you know, Langham's buying 10,000 acres of land, and that will take them 20 years to restore that. But that's the sort of timescales that communities can think in, because they're not driven by short-term investment financial decisions, which a lot of landowners are driven by, and that's the really big difference.
We've got a question here from Beth, who thinks she'd like to hear more about whether you think that there'll be more community ownership in the future. It sounded like there was quite a positive outlook, I think, from your talk. So is that something that you feel like we will see more of?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's far more. If you look at the projects that are coming forward to the Scottish Land Fund, they're much greater in number. As I say, they tend to be smaller assets, say, than a whole island like Eigg. But, you know, in many communities across Scotland now, you know, they're worried about housing, they're worried about losing their services and facilities. So the Scottish Government is, you know, very supportive in terms of the rights to buy that it's given communities to acquire land and buildings. And there's also a commitment within the current programme for government to expand the Scottish Land Fund to £20 million a year by the end of this Parliament. So yeah, there is the support, and there's lots of learning out there. As I say, I imagine Maggie has seen practically every community landowner in Scotland who's been to Eigg to learn what can happen. So there's lots of learning to share as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, Danny, there was something I wanted to bring up, was that we'd spoken a bit before about how it seems to me that quite a lot of photographers have been drawn to Scottish island communities like Paulstrand, you know, for documented South Uist in the 1950s. And I wondered if you wanted to kind of speak a little bit more about how you felt that your series fitted into that kind of wider history of documentary photography in Scotland, and kind of what role that plays in, you know, planning for the future.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Strand's work's legendary, and I guess what it holds true for me really is that it's a snapshot into the heart of a community that will forever be sort of like a foundation building block in terms of how it's viewed and remembered. And I think that's quite a beautiful thing to be a part of, really. I mean, it's hard to say, to be honest with you, how photography plays a part in building the future. I think that's a really difficult question. I think that it was very important for the community. From what the feedback that I received, I remember being told by several people at the exhibition their thoughts and their reflections about what it had done for them, and it had like living on an island community, and indeed in Cornwall, where I am based, in winter it can be quite a difficult task. You know, it can be quite hard, and not everything's roses. You know, it's a bit of a graft sometimes. And I was told that this collection of images had helped them, remind them of what it was that drew them to Eigg in the first place. And I think that was quite a powerful thing to give them a moment to reflect on how far they'd come themselves.
Yeah, it's a record of kind of where you are at that moment, and you know for future generations, which again is kind of, you know, links to all the themes of the census that we've been touching on. We don't have any further questions at the moment. I don't know if there's any final comments that any of our speakers wanted to make before we wrapped up. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think, you know, there's many different directions it could have gone in.
I think, Louise, if I may, I think just coming back to the point about focusing on the people, I think is really important, because you know, there's a lot of talk in the press at the moment about rewilding and biodiversity, and that somehow that's at odds with people being there, and it's either, you know, habitats or people, and that's completely wrong. And I think Eigg proves that, you know, not only is the practical side of actually you need people there to plant your trees, or to look after the wildlife, or to manage the renewables, or whatever it is, or restore the peatland. So you actually do need people, but many people see a lot of these landscapes as empty landscapes, and they're not empty. they've got people in them, and they had people in them. And I think that's what's really important about Danny's work, that it shows that what externally might seem as really sort of barren, wild, empty landscapes are not, and they're not there to be, you know, to have external people's visions imposed on them, that the people that live there are incredibly important.
I've just got a question from Grania saying that there's an interesting parallel between Danny's community-led practice and Ailsa's comment that everything is all about the people, and whether that's reflected in the thoughts, you know, for the census exhibition. And I think, you know, it was all about people in Scotland, and, you know, how we work together and how we're planning for the future, and how it connects to kind of past and future generations. So there's lots of strong, I think, parallels there.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about Eigg, is that, you know, it's this idea that we're not an intentional community. It's just a random bunch of people. I always quote this one guy that lives here actually arrived in a kayak one day and never left. And it's just a random bunch of people, but it's a passion about where you live and wanting to see it flourish for the future.
Yeah, and I think that idea is, you know, just the same as you live in, you know, a suburb of Glasgow, as if you live on a small island. It's that kind of sense of community, and I think that's particularly evident in Eigg, and that's what's so fascinating about the community there. So I think that's probably the end, all we've got time for today. So thank you very much to all of your speakers, and I think we're probably going to see quite a lot of us on the Isle of Eigg visiting in the next few years. Well, certainly myself would really like to visit, having seen Danny's photographs and heard more about it. So look out for us there. We'll look you up.
Do that. Do that.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I do hope that everybody will make it along to see the exhibition, which is on until the 25th of September. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everybody.